The morning started like any other Tuesday for Quaim Henderson. He woke up at 5:30 when his alarm buzzed on the nightstand, and he lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling of his small apartment. The water heater had been acting up again, and he knew the shower would be cold, but that was just how things went sometimes. He worked at a distribution warehouse about 20 minutes from his place, and he had been doing that job for almost 11 years. Now it paid the bills and kept food on the table, and that was enough for him. But today was different because today he had to take his daughter, Nadia, to a music school across town. She was 15 years old and had been playing piano for about 3 years now. The girl had real talent, and everyone who heard her said the same thing. Quaim wanted her to have opportunities he never got. So when the Belmont Conservatory offered free placement tests for young musicians, he signed her up right away. He did not tell her how nervous he was about walking into a place like that, a fancy music school full of professors and prodigies, and people who probably never worked a day of hard labor in their lives. He kept those feelings to himself, because this was about Nadia, not about him. Quaim got dressed in the cleanest clothes he owned, which was a pair of dark jeans and a button-up shirt that still had the creases from being folded in his drawer. He looked at himself in the mirror and tried to smooth down his hair, but it was not cooperating. At 41 years old, he had a few gray streaks coming in near his temples, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they were last year. Life had a way of leaving marks on a person. Nadia was already awake when he came out of his room. She was sitting at the small kitchen table eating cereal and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when he walked in and gave him a little smile. "You look nice, Dad," she said. He grunted and poured himself some coffee from the pot she had already made. She was a good kid, and she always had been, even when her mother left 6 years ago, and it was just the two of them trying to figure things out. They did not talk about her mother much anymore. Some wounds do not heal right when you keep picking at them. The drive to Belmont took longer than expected because of traffic on the highway. Quaim gripped the steering wheel and tried to stay calm while cars honked and squeezed into lanes without signaling. Nadia sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, and he could tell she was nervous too. Even though she was trying to hide it, she had her headphones around her neck and her fingers kept tapping against her thigh like she was practicing invisible keys. When they finally pulled up to the conservatory, Quaim felt his stomach drop. The building was massive, with tall white columns out front and huge windows that reflected the morning sun. There were stone steps leading up to heavy wooden doors, and the whole place looked like something from a movie about rich people. He parked the car in a visitor spot and sat there for a moment just staring. "This is it, huh?" Nadia said quietly. "Yeah," Quaim replied, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Got out and walked toward the entrance together. Quaim noticed how his work boots looked scuffed and worn against the polished stone steps. He noticed how other parents walking in wore expensive coats and carried themselves with a kind of confidence he did not have. He felt like everyone was looking at him and knowing he did not belong, but he pushed that feeling down and kept walking because Nadia needed him to be strong right now. Inside, the building was even more impressive. The ceiling was so high it seemed to go on forever, and there were paintings on the walls of composers and musicians. Quaim did not recognize a crystal chandelier hung in the center of the main hall, catching light and throwing little rainbows across the marble floor. The air smelled clean and polished like lemon furniture spray and old books. There was a grand piano sitting in the corner of the waiting area. It was black and shiny and bigger than any piano Quaim had ever seen up close. He looked at it and something twisted in his chest. A memory tried to surface, but he pushed it back down where it belonged. They checked in at a front desk where a woman with glasses and a tight smile handed them paperwork to fill out. Nadia did most of the writing while Quaim stood there feeling useless and out of place. After about 10 minutes, a young man in a sweater vest came to collect Nadia for her test. She looked back at her father with wide eyes, and he gave her a nod. "You got this, baby girl," he said. She took a deep breath and followed the young man down a long hallway until she disappeared around a corner, and then Quaim was alone. He stood there in the grand hall, not sure what to do with himself. Other parents had found seats on velvet benches or wandered off to look at the artwork, but he could not bring himself to do either. He felt frozen like a statue that someone had placed in the wrong museum. A woman at the desk told him he could wait in a smaller studio down the hall where it would be quieter. He thanked her and walked in the direction she pointed. Studio was a medium-sized room with wooden floors and tall windows that let in soft, natural light. There were music stands folded up in one corner and chairs stacked against the wall, and in the center of the room sat another piano. This one was brown, with a warm honey color to the wood, and it looked old but well cared for. Quaim stood in the doorway and stared at it. His heart started beating faster, and his palms got sweaty. He had not told anyone this, but there was a time when he could play along. Time ago, back when he was just a kid growing up on the east side of the city, his grandmother had taught him. She was a church pianist who could make an old broken down upright sound like a full orchestra. She saw something in him when he was young, and she nurtured it with patience and love and hours of practice in her tiny living room. By the time he was 12, Quaim could play pieces that most adults struggled with. His grandmother used to say he had a gift from God, and that one day the whole world would hear him play. But the world had other plans. When he was 17, his grandmother passed away from a stroke. She went to sleep one night and never woke up. Quaim was the one who found her the next morning, still and peaceful in her bed, like she was just resting. Something broke inside him that day. He tried to play at her funeral, but his hands would not cooperate. Notes came out wrong and empty, and he walked away from the piano halfway through the song. He never played again after that. He packed up his grandmother memories and buried them deep in his heart where they could not hurt him anymore. Now standing in this studio at Belmont Conservatory, those memories were trying to claw their way back to the surface. Quaim walked slowly toward the piano like it was a wild animal that might bite. He sat down on the bench, and the leather creaked under his weight. His hands hovered over the keys, but he did not touch them. He could hear his grandmother's voice in his head. She used to tell him that music was not about being perfect. It was about being honest. It was about taking whatever you were feeling inside and letting it flow through your fingers into the keys and out into the air. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of birds outside the window, and for the first time in over 20 years, Quaim let himself remember what it felt like to be a boy with a gift and a grandmother who believed in him. He did not know that someone was about to walk through that door. He did not know that the next few minutes would change everything. All he knew was that he was tired of running from his past, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop. Quaim sat there on that piano bench with his eyes closed and his hands hovering over the keys like they were afraid to land. He could feel the weight of all those years pressing down on him. 23 years since he last played, 23 years since his grandmother's funeral, when he walked away from music and never looked back. The silence in that room was thick and heavy and full of ghosts. Then the door opened behind him and everything changed. A woman walked in carrying a stack of folders and a cup of coffee. She had silver streaks in her dark hair and wore a long cardigan that looked soft and expensive. Her glasses sat perched on the end of her nose, and she had the kind of face that looked like it smiled a lot, even when she was not smiling. She stopped when she saw Quaim at the piano and tilted her head like a bird examining something curious. "Oh, wonderful," she said in a warm voice. "You must be my 11:30." Quaim turned around on the bench and opened his mouth to explain that no, he was not her 11:30, and he was just a parent waiting for his daughter. But before he could get the words out, she was already moving across the room and setting her things down on a small table by the window. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at him with kind eyes. "I am Professor Adeline Okafor," she said. "I teach advanced piano studies here at Belmont, and I have to apologize for running a few minutes late. Traffic this morning was absolutely brutal. Felt his throat go dry. He should have corrected her right then and there. He should have stood up and explained the misunderstanding and walked out of that room, but something kept him frozen on that bench. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, like she expected something from him. Maybe it was the piano sitting right there under his fingertips calling to him after all these years, or maybe he was just tired of being invisible. Professor Okafor walked over to a cabinet and pulled out some sheet music. She flipped through the pages and nodded to herself like she was having a private conversation in her head. We usually start adult assessments with something from the classical repertoire, she explained. It helps me understand where you are technically and emotionally as a player. She pulled out a piece and brought it over to the piano stand. Quayne looked at the title and his heart nearly stopped. It was Chopin Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the same piece his grandmother had taught him when he was just 12 years old, the same piece he had practiced hundreds of times in her tiny living room with the afternoon sun coming through the curtains and the smell of her cooking filling the air. He remembered how she would sit beside him and hum along while he played. He remembered how she would close her eyes and sway gently when he got to the parts that made her feel something deep. This piece was not just music to him, it was a memory. It was a wound. It was everything he had been running from. Professor Okafor must have noticed something in his face because she paused and looked at him more closely. Are you all right? She asked. You look like you have seen a ghost. Quayne swallowed hard and tried to find his voice. I know this piece, he said quietly. His own words surprised him. He had not meant to say that out loud. Professor Okafor raised her eyebrows and a small smile crossed her lips. Wonderful, she said. Then let us see what you remember. She stepped back and gestured toward the keys, like she was inviting him into a conversation. Quayne looked down at his hands. They were rough and calloused from years of lifting boxes and operating machinery. His knuckles were scarred from small accidents at the warehouse, and his fingernails were cut short and uneven. These were not the hands of a pianist. These were the hands of a working man who had forgotten what it meant to create something beautiful. But somewhere underneath all that roughness there was still a boy who used to make his grandmother cry with his playing. There was still a gift buried deep, even if it had been sleeping for a very long time. Quayne placed his fingers on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth against his skin. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Professor Okafor watched him with patient curiosity. The room was completely silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere on the wall. He pressed the first key. The note rang out clear and pure, and it hit him like a wave crashing against rocks. His fingers moved to the next key, and then the next. Opening of the bell. It was slow and haunting and full of longing. It was supposed to sound like a question being asked in the dark. Quayne remembered that he remembered his grandmother explaining it to him all those years ago. She said this piece tells a story about someone looking back at their life and wondering what it all meant. She said the music asks questions that maybe do not have answers. His fingers stumbled on the third measure. The notes came out clumsy and uncertain, like a child learning to walk again after being in bed for too long. Professor Okafor made a small note on her clipboard, but did not say anything. Quayne felt embarrassment rise up in his chest. He almost stopped right there. He almost pulled his hands away and apologized and ran out of that room like he should have done from the beginning. But then something happened. A voice spoke in his head, and it sounded exactly like his grandmother. Keep going, baby, she said. Do not let fear steal your music. Wang closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about his hands and his mistakes and the woman watching him. Stop thinking about the 23 years of silence and the grief he had carried like a stone in his chest. He let go of everything except the music, and he began to play for real. His fingers found their way, like they had been waiting all this time for permission to move again. The muscle memory was still there, buried underneath layers of dust and neglect. The notes started flowing smoother and the melody began to take shape. Could feel the piano responding to him like an old friend who had missed him terribly. Ballade moved into its first theme, and Quame let the emotion pour through him all. The sadness he had been holding on to for so many years came rising up like water breaking through a dam. He thought about his grandmother's hands, showing him where to place his fingers. He thought about the way she would hug him after a good practice and tell him she was proud. He thought about the morning he found her gone, and how the world had turned gray and cold. The music captured all of it, every tear he never cried, and every word he never said, and every goodbye he never got to give. Professor Okafor had stopped writing her. Clipboard hung forgotten at her side, and her coffee sat untouched on the table. She was staring at Quame with her mouth slightly open and her eyes wide behind her glasses. She had heard hundreds of students play this piece over her 30 years of teaching. She had heard professionals perform it in concert halls around the world, but she had never heard anyone play it quite like this. There was something raw and honest in the way this man touched the keys. It was not technically perfect. There were small errors here and there, and moments where his fingers hesitated, but the emotion was undeniable. It was the kind of playing that could not be taught in a classroom. It came from somewhere deeper than skill or practice. It came from the soul. Quame did not notice that he was crying. Tears were running down his face and dropping onto the keys, but he kept playing. He was not in that studio anymore. He was back in his grandmother's living room with the afternoon light and the smell of her lavender perfume and the sound of her voice telling him he was going to do great things someday. Was 12 years old again, and the world was still full of possibility. The door to the Tis de Jeweled to the Kiss of Deal studio had drifted open at some point. A few people walking by in the hallway had stopped to listen. One of them was a young man with a violin case who stood frozen in the doorway. Another was an older gentleman in a suit who had been on his way to a meeting but could not bring himself to leave. They all watched in silence as this stranger in worn jeans and scuffed work boots played Chopin like his life depended on it. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew where he came from, but everyone in that hallway could feel that something special was happening. Something that did not happen very often. Something that reminded them why they fell in love with music in the first place. And Quame just kept playing, lost in the memories. Lost in the music. Finally, coming home after being away for far too long, the music filled every corner of that studio like water filling a glass. It spilled out into the hallway and wrapped around the people standing there, watching in silence. Quame had reached the middle section of the ballade, where the melody shifts from sadness into something fierce and powerful. His grandmother used to call this the storm part. She said this is where the music stops asking questions and starts demanding answers. His fingers moved faster, now dancing across the keys with a confidence that surprised even him. The rust was shaking off with every note, and the years of silence were melting away like snow in springtime. He was not thinking about technique or finger placement or any of the things his grandmother used to drill into him during practice. He was just feeling pure, raw, honest feeling pouring out of him and into that piano. Professor Okafor had not moved from her spot by the window. She was watching Quame with an expression that shifted between disbelief and wondering. Her 3 decades of teaching, she had learned to spot talent within the first few measures of a performance. She could tell right away if someone had potential or if they were just going through the motions. But this man was different. This man was not performing at all. He was confessing. Every note he played was like a secret he had been keeping locked inside for years. The crowd in the doorway had grown larger. Now a woman with gray hair and a pearl necklace had stopped on her way to the faculty lounge. 2 students, carrying instrument cases, stood pressed against the wall, trying not to make a sound. A maintenance worker who had been changing a light bulb down the hall had set down his ladder and walked over to see what was happening. Nobody spoke. Nobody whispered. They just listened. Quame reached the most difficult passage of the piece. where the right hand has to fly across the upper keys, while the left hand holds down a complicated pattern below this, was the part that used to make him practice for hours until his fingers ached and his eyes burned from staring at the sheet. Music, he stumbled a little here. A few notes came out muddy and unclear, but he did not stop. He pushed through the way his grandmother taught him to push through. She always said mistakes are just part of the conversation between you and the music. Do not apologize for them. Do not hide from them. Just keep talking, and that is exactly what Quame did. He kept talking through his fingers, kept pouring out everything he had been carrying inside. The grief of losing the only person who ever truly believed in him. The shame of walking away from his gift when life got hard. The loneliness of all those years spent working in silence while the music inside him slowly went quiet. The guilt of never becoming the man his grandmother thought he would be of it came flooding out through those keys. The ballad built toward its final climax where everything comes together in a thunderous wave of sound. Quame could feel the energy rising in his chest, like a fire that had been smoldering for decades and was finally getting the oxygen it needed to blaze. His whole body was moving with the music now. His shoulders swayed and his head nodded, and his foot pressed the pedal with perfect timing, even though he had not consciously thought about the pedal in over 20 years. It was like his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. Professor Okafor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back and swallowed hard because she did not want to make a sound that might break the spell. The young man with the violin case had pulled out his phone and was recording without even realizing he had done it. Just felt like this moment needed to be captured somehow, like it was too important to let slip away unremembered. Wham hit the final cascade of notes. The music crashed down like waves against a rocky shore. His fingers slammed the keys with everything he had left, and then silence, complete total silence. The last chord hung in the air for what felt like forever. Quame sat there, with his hands still on the keys and his eyes still closed. His chest was heaving, and his face was wet with tears. He did not remember crying. He felt empty in the best possible way, like a wound that had finally been drained of all its poison. For a Tizen 4 moment, nobody moved. The people in the doorway stood frozen. Professor Okafor remained by the window with one hand pressed against her heart. Even the dust and the sunlight seemed to pause mid-air. Then someone started clapping. It was the maintenance worker. With the ladder, he brought his rough, calloused hands together in a slow, steady rhythm. Then the woman with the pearl necklace joined in. Then the students, then everyone. The applause grew louder and filled the hallway and echoed off the high ceilings of Belmont Conservatory. Quam opened his eyes slowly, like a man waking up from a long dream, turned on the bench and saw all these people standing there, looking at him with tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces. Saw Professor Okafor walking toward him with her hand over her mouth. He saw strangers who had no idea, who he was applauding like he had just performed at some grand concert hall. He had absolutely no idea what to say. "Who are you, Professor?" Okafor finally asked her. Voice was thick with emotion, and she had to clear her throat before she could continue. "Where in the world did you learn to play like that?" Quame wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked down at his worn jeans and his scuffed work boots, and his calloused fingers resting on the keys of this beautiful instrument. "I am nobody," he said quietly. "Just a father waiting for his daughter to finish her test." Professor Okafor stared at him like he had just told her the sky was green. "That is not possible," she said. "I have students who have trained for 15 years who cannot play with half the emotion you just showed." "What conservatory did you attend? Who was your teacher?" Quame let out a long breath. "My grandmother," he said. "She was a church pianist back in Detroit. She taught me when I was a kid. I stopped playing when I was 17. That was 23 years ago." Crowd murmured. People exchanged glances of disbelief. 23 years without touching a piano, and he had just performed one of the most difficult pieces in the romantic repertoire with enough raw power to bring a room full of strangers to tears. Professor Okafor sat down on the bench next to him. She moved slowly like she was approaching something fragile and precious. Why did you stop? She asked gently. Quaim was quiet for a long moment. He could feel his grandmother's presence in the room, even though he knew that was impossible. He could smell her lavender perfume and hear her voice humming along to his playing. She passed away, he finally said, and I could not make myself play after that. It hurt too much. She was the only reason I played in the first place. When she was gone, the music just felt empty. Professor Okafor nodded slowly. She understood that kind of loss. She had seen it before in students who walked away from their instruments after tragedy struck. Music has a way of holding our deepest feelings, she said. Sometimes those feelings are too heavy to carry, but I think your grandmother would want you to know that the music did not leave you. It was waiting. All this time, it was just waiting for you to come back. Wayne felt fresh tears building behind his eyes. He blinked hard and looked away. In the crowd by the door, he noticed a familiar face. His daughter, Nadia, was standing there with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her mouth wide open. She must have finished her test and come looking for him. She was staring at her father like she had never seen him before in her life. Dad, she whispered. Wayne did not know what to say. He had never told her about his past. He had never told her about his grandmother or the gift he walked away from. He had never wanted her to know that side of him because it was too painful to explain. But now it was all out in the open. Every secret he had buried was floating in the air between them, and there was no taking it back. Why did you never tell me? Nadia asked. Her voice cracked on the last word. Quaim stood up from the bench on shaky legs. He walked toward his daughter, and the crowd parted to let him through. He stood in front of her and looked into her eyes, which were the same eyes his grandmother used to have, full of curiosity and hope and love. Because I was afraid, he admitted, afraid that if I started playing again, I would remember everything I lost. But standing here, now looking at you, I realized something. I was so busy protecting myself from the past that I almost forgot to live in the present. Nadia threw her arms around him. She hugged him tight, and he hugged her back. And for the first time in 23 years, Quaim felt like maybe he could finally breathe again. Maybe he could finally stop running. Maybe his grandmother had been right all along. The music never left him. It just waited. And now it was time to see where it would take him next. Quaim held his daughter for a long time. Neither of them wanted to let go. The crowd in the hallway had started to thin out as people slowly returned to their schedules and responsibilities. But the energy of what had just happened still hung in the air like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. Professor Okafor stood nearby watching the father and daughter embrace. She had been teaching at Belmont for 31 years, and she thought she had seen everything: prodigies who burned out before they turned 20, late bloomers who discovered their talent in middle-aged students who played with technical perfection but no soul, and students who played with so much emotion they could barely hold it together. But she had never seen anything quite like this. A man who had not touched a piano in over 2 decades, sitting down and playing Chopin like he was having a conversation with someone who was no longer there, was the kind of moment that reminded her why she became a teacher in the first place. She waited until Quaim and Nadia finally pulled apart before she spoke again. I need to introduce you to someone, she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency underneath it. The director of our conservatory is going to want to meet you. Quaim shook his head quickly. No, that is not necessary, he said. I'm not a musician. I am just a warehouse worker. I should not even be here. Professor Okafor stepped closer and looked him directly in the eyes. With all due respect, she said gently, what I just witnessed was not the playing of someone who is not a musician. That was the playing of someone who has been running from their calling for a very long time. Kira did not know how to respond. He looked at Nadia, who was still staring at him with wide eyes full of questions. She squeezed his hand and gave him a small nod. Just talk to them, Dad, she said softly. What is the worst that could happen? Quaim let out a long breath. His whole body felt Heavy and light at the same time. Heavy from the weight of everything he had just released, light from the freedom of finally letting it go. Okay, he said quietly. I will talk to them. Professor Okafor smiled and gestured for them to follow her down the hallway. They walked past practice rooms where students were running through scales and arpeggios. They passed a small recital hall where a string quartet was rehearsing something complex and beautiful. Every corner of this building was alive with sound and creativity, and passing Quaim felt like a ghost walking through a world he had abandoned long ago. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate that read, Director Bernard Achebe. Professor Okafor knocked twice, and a deep voice from inside called out for them to enter. The office was large and filled with sunlight from a wall of windows overlooking the campus. Gardens bookshelves lined every wall, stuffed with scores and manuscripts and framed photographs of famous musicians. Behind a massive oak desk sat a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes. He wore a dark suit with a deep burgundy tie, and he had the calm presence of someone who had spent a lifetime surrounded by greatness. Director Achebe stood up when they entered and walked around his desk to greet them. Professor Okafor, he said warmly, I have been hearing whispers in the hallway about something extraordinary. He turned his attention to Quaim and studied him for a moment. And you must be the gentleman who caused all the commotion. Quaim shifted uncomfortably. I did not mean to cause any trouble, sir, he said. It was all a misunderstanding. I was just waiting for my daughter. Director Achebe smiled and gestured toward a pair of leather chairs in front of his desk. Please sit, he said. Both of Quaim and Nadia sat down, while Professor Okafor remained standing by the door. Director returned to his seat and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. Professor Okafor tells me you played Chopin. Ballade number 1, he said, and that you have not played piano in over 20 years. Is that correct? Wayne nodded slowly. Yes, Sir Director. Achebe leaned back in his chair and let out a thoughtful breath. I have been running this conservatory for almost 15 years, he said. Before that, I performed professionally for 20 years in concert halls across Europe and Asia. I have heard thousands of pianists play that piece. Some of them were technically flawless. Some of them were emotionally stirring. Very few were both. He paused and looked at Quaim with an intensity that made him want to look away. Professor Okafor says, you were both, she continued. She says, it was one of the most authentic performances she has ever witnessed in her career. Quaim did not know what to say. He looked down at his hands resting in his lap. The same rough, calloused hands that had just done something he never thought they would do again. I was just playing for my grandmother, he finally said. She passed away a long time ago, and I never got to say goodbye properly. I think that is what came out. Director Achebe nodded slowly. That is exactly what makes a great musician, he said. The ability to channel personal truth through the instrument technique can be taught. Emotion cannot. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the gardens below. I have some of the most talented young pianists in the country studying here at Belmont, he said. They practice for hours every day. They study theory and history and composition. They work harder than most people can imagine, but many of them struggle with one thing. He turned back to face Quamathi, struggle to play with meaning. They hit all the right notes in all the right places, but something is missing. The soul is missing. The story is missing. They do not know how to make the audience feel what they are feeling. Quaim listened quietly. He thought about all those hours in his grandmother's living room. She never talked about technique the way these conservatory professors probably did. She talked about truth. She talked about pain and joy and love and loss. She taught him that music was just another language for saying the things that words could not capture. I have a proposal for you, Director Achebe said. Quaim looked up. A proposal, he repeated. Director Achebe sat back down and leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. I would like you to speak to some of my advanced students, he said. Perhaps even demonstrate for them what you did today. Show them what it did means to play from the heart instead of just from the page. Quaim felt panic rising in his chest. Sir, I am not qualified to teach anyone anything, he said quickly. I work in a warehouse. I move boxes for a living. I do not have any degrees or certifications. I cannot even read sheet music anymore. Director Akabe held up a hand to stop him. I am not asking you to teach technique, he said calmly. I am asking you to share your story. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from people who have lived through something real. Your journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of music. Nadia reached over and grabbed her father's hand. Dad, she whispered, this is amazing. You have to do this. Quam looked at his daughter. He saw the excitement in her eyes. He saw the pride that was replacing the confusion from earlier. For so long he had hidden this part of himself from her. He thought he was protecting her from his pain, but maybe he was just protecting himself. Maybe he was afraid she would see him as a failure, a man who had a gift and threw it away. But the way she was looking at him now was not the look of someone seeing a failure. It was the look of someone seeing their father in a whole new light, and that look gave him courage. Okay, Quam said slowly, I will do it, but I cannot promise it will be any good, Director. Achebe smiled widely. That is all I ask, he said. Just be yourself. Just tell your truth. He stood up and extended his hand. Quam shook it firmly. Welcome to Belmont, Director Achebe said, even if only for today. As they left the office, Nadia could not stop smiling. She kept looking at her father like she was seeing a stranger who was also somehow exactly the same person she had known her whole life. Dad, she said, as they walked down the hallway, why did you never tell me you could play like that? Quam sighed. It is complicated, baby girl, he said. When your grandmother passed away, it felt like part of me died with her. The music was connected to her in a way I cannot explain. Playing without her felt like betraying her memory somehow. He paused and looked at his daughter. But I think I was wrong, he admitted. I think she would have wanted me to keep playing. I think she would have been disappointed that I stopped. Nadia squeezed his arm. She is probably smiling right now, she said softly, wherever she is. Quam felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different. These were not tears of grief or pain. They were tears of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Professor Okafor led them to a larger practice hall where a group of about 15 students had already gathered. Word had spread fast through the conservatory about the mystery man who made the faculty cry with his playing. Now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Quam stood at the entrance of the hall looking at all those young, eager faces. They were looking back at him, waiting for something. He had no idea what he was going to say. He had no plan. He had no script. All he had was his story, and maybe that was enough. Quam stepped into that practice hall and felt every pair of eyes land on him like spotlights. There were about 15 students sitting in chairs arranged in a semicircle around a grand piano. Some of them looked curious, some looked skeptically. Few looked like they were wondering why a man in worn jeans and work boots was about to address them in their fancy conservatory. He understood that look. He had given that same look to himself in the mirror earlier. That morning, Professor Okafor stood off to the side with an encouraging smile. Director Achebe had taken a seat in the back row, wanting to observe without interfering. Nadia found a spot near the window where she could watch her father without being in the way. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the heating system and the distant sound of someone practicing violin down the hall. Quam walked slowly toward the piano and ran his fingers along its polished surface. He did not sit down. Yet instead, he turned to face the students and took a deep breath. I am not sure what you all have heard about me, he began. His voice was rougher than he wanted it to be, but I am guessing word travels fast around here. A few students nodded. One young woman in the front row with braids and bright eyes spoke up. They said you played Chopin like you were possessed, she said. They said Professor Okafor. Creed. Quam let out a small laugh. I do not know about possessed, he said, but I do know that what happened in that studio was not something I planned. It just happened. He paused and looked around the room at all these young, talented faces, each One of them had probably been playing since they were children. Each one had probably sacrificed friendships and free time and normal teenage experiences to pursue their craft. They had technique and training and discipline, but Director Achebe said they were missing something. And Quaim thought maybe he understood what that something was. Let me tell you about my grandmother. He said she was born in a small town in Georgia back in 1932. Her family did not have much money, but they had a piano that someone donated to their church. My grandmother learned to play on that piano when she was just 6 years old. Nobody taught her. She just sat down one day and started figuring it out on her own. The students were listening now. Skepticism on some of their faces was starting to fade. By the time she was a teenager, she was the main pianist at that church. Quaim continued. People came from all over just to hear her play on Sundays. She could take a simple hymn and turn it into something that made grown men weep. She did not read music very well. She played by ear and by heart. She said the notes on the page were just suggestions. The real music came from somewhere deeper. He walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. His fingers found the keys automatically, like they had been waiting for permission. When I was 7 years old, my mother dropped me off at my grandmother's house and never came back. Quaim said. His voice got quieter. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because it matters to the story. My grandmother raised me from that day forward, and she taught me everything she knew about music. But more than that, she taught me everything she knew about life. He pressed a single key and let the note ring out. She used to say that the piano is just a mirror. He continued. It reflects whatever you bring to it. If you bring fear, it will sound afraid. If you bring anger, it will sound angry. If you bring love, it will sound like love. You cannot fake it. The instrument always knows the truth. A young man in the second row raised his hand. Quaim nodded at him. How do you stop being afraid? He asked. His voice was soft and vulnerable. I've been playing since I was 4 years old, and I still get terrified every time I perform. I freeze up and forget everything. I practice. Quaim looked at him with understanding. What is your name? He asked Tobias. The young man replied. Tobias. Quaim repeated. Let me ask you something. When you sit down at the piano, what are you thinking about? Tobias shifted in his seat. I think about not making mistakes, he admitted. I think about what my teachers will say. I think about whether I am good enough. I think about everyone watching and judging. McQuaim nodded slowly. That is the problem right there, he said. You are thinking about yourself, but music is not about you. It is about something bigger than you. When my grandmother played, she was not thinking about herself at all. She was thinking about the people listening. She was thinking about the message she wanted to share. She was thinking about the feelings she wanted to create in the room. She disappeared into the music, and that is when the magic happened. Professor Okafor was nodding along from her spot by the wall. This was exactly what she had been trying to teach her students for years. But hearing it from someone who had lived, it was different. Landed differently, Quan turned back to the piano and placed both hands on the keys. Let me show you what I mean. He said, I am going to play something, and I want you all to close your eyes to not think about technique or theory, or whether I am hitting the right notes. Just listen. Feel what the music is trying to tell you. Students closed their eyes. Quaim took a deep breath and began to play. It was not Chopin this time. It was something simpler, a melody his grandmother used to hum while she cooked dinner in her tiny kitchen. He did not know if it was a real song or something she made up, but it was burned into his memory like a brand. The notes were gentle and warm, like sunlight coming through a window on a lazy afternoon. They told a story of love and patience and quiet strength. They spoke of hands that worked hard all day and still found time to teach a little boy how to make beauty out of thin air. As he played, Quaim thought about all the years he had wasted running from this gift. He thought about the silence he had wrapped himself in like a blanket. He thought about how afraid he had been to feel anything, because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant hurting. But sitting here now with his fingers dancing across these keys, he realized something important. The hurt was still there. It would always be there. But so was the love, and maybe that was the whole point. Maybe music was not about escaping pain. Maybe it was about holding pain and joy together in the same breath. Maybe it was about being fully alive, even when being alive was hard. Finished the melody and let his hands rest on his lap. The room was completely silent when the students opened their eyes. Several of them had tears on their cheeks. Tobias was one of them. What was that the young woman with braids asked softly? That was my grandmother. Quaim replied, that was her in the kitchen, humming while she fried chicken. That was her tucking me in at night and telling me I was going to do great things. That was her teaching me that music is not something you do it, it's something you art. Director. Ashebis stood up from his seat in the back row. He walked toward the front of the room with slow, deliberate steps. What you have just witnessed, he said to the students, is what we spend years trying to cultivate in this program: authenticity, vulnerability, truth. You can practice scales for 10,000 hours, but if you cannot access what this man just showed, you will never truly move an audience. He turned to Kwame. Would like to offer you a position here at Belmont, he said, not as a traditional instructor, but as something else here. Mentor, perhaps, someone who can remind our students why they fell in love with music in the first place. Quaim felt his heart skip. He looked at Nadia, who was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split in half. He looked at Professor Okafor, who was nodding enthusiastically. Looked at all these young students who were staring at him like he had just shown them a door they never knew existed. I do not know what to say. He admitted, say yes. Nadia called out from her spot by the window. Everyone smiled for what felt like the first time in years, a real smile, one that reached all the way to his eyes. Okay, he said. Yes. 3 years later, Quaim stood in front of a graduating class at Belmont Conservatory. He had completed his own degree while teaching and mentoring students along the way. It had not been easy. There were nights when he doubted himself. There were moments when the grief came flooding back and he had to excuse himself to cry in his office. But he kept going. He kept playing. He kept sharing his grandmother wisdom with anyone who would listen. Nadia had graduated from the conservatory program herself and was now preparing to audition for a prestigious music academy overseas. She played with the same fire her father had rediscovered that fateful day. Above the piano in his office hung a framed photograph of his grandmother. She was sitting at her church piano with her hands on the keys and a smile on her face. Every time Quaim looked at that picture, he could hear her voice in his head. You were always meant for this, baby, she whispered. I was just waiting for you to believe it too. And finally, after all those years of running, he did.